The significance of filmmaking in 20 minutes. If one has ever attempted to put a film together, they might find themselves in a situation where they are viewing any other films henceforth the way an adept in music theory perceives pieces of music. They pull it apart, can identify why the song is having the psychological effect that it has, and all the while still appreciating the work for what it is, perhaps even more so, despite the actual construction of the composition not being a total mystery to them. However, whereas even a layperson could acknowledge that classical composition or jazz pieces are of an intense degree of creative sophistication and dense achievement, even if they prefer to listen to pop or rock music, I don't know if the same can be said of the film medium. It could even be said of literature that a reader of Tom Clancy, Stephanie Meyer, J.K. Rowling, or Edward Stratemeyer might still acknowledge that there are levels of literary sophistication and complexity which warrant admiration and demonstrate exceptional skill, even if they do not enjoy their prose personally. The likes of James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Salman Rushdie, or Yann Martel would never be denied the status of visionary authors. It is understood that even if one treats their literature as the equivalent of potato chips and beer, there was and is a realm of greater experimentation, compositional creativity, and artistic finesse to be explored beyond the more plainly escapist, comparatively straightforward literature, and which ought to be respected or at least allowed to exist, and isn't necessarily thought of as vapid Emperor's New Clothes or bourgeois, insular, privileged explorations of a secure status in society, divorced from the experiences of the struggling, the working people, the common unprivileged, suffering human being. The same cannot be said for film. There are many who would decry the efforts of a Godard, a Fellini, a Bergman, or especially a Michael Snow, or a Bill Viola, or an Antonioni as being elitist, existing so that certain viewers can feel they are superior to other viewers who do not appreciate it, who are too invested in watching material by the likes of Michael Bay, Marvel superhero works, Fast and Furious films, or even the likes of a Star Wars, Spielberg movies, or the great classic early Disney animated features. Film has never been seen by many as more than the equivalent of potato chips and beer when they get home from work in the evening. This may be no bad thing. People can perceive films however they want, although where cause for concern arises is when the hypothetical suggestion emerges that these bracket of films, of a more supposedly intellectual, experimental, or modernist novel-esque variety, ought not to exist at all, which most would never dare say of the literary or musical equivalents, and that they have no value beyond the allure of impressing those with banal superiority complexes, who use their appreciation of these potentially alienating or esoteric films as proof of their being of greater intellectual merit to the average person. I would like to explain how one can learn to appreciate the more purely compositional attributes of the film medium without having to have made a film themselves. At the end of the day, I'm just some guy. I'm not special. I'm no different than any of you. And I highly admire these films, and I'd like to tell you why. The first thing one needs to be aware of is that ultimately the thing you like most about a film, what is making the film enticing to you, is the telling of the film, not the plot, not even necessarily the actors, for they contribute in executing the material itself, but the enunciation of events. You aren't choosing to read the screenplay of the film, you're watching the film. So you can't claim that the story is what matters most, otherwise you'd just be reading the scripts, indifferent as to how it came across in filmic form. This is a point known to many, or any, who are slightly familiar with the works of Claude Chabrol, both his writings as a critic and in his feature films. The great Australian film critic Adrian Martin once remarked how he read the script in advance of seeing one of Chabrol's feature films, and considered the script to be rather rotten. To his surprise, he found the film to be of tremendous quality, confirming Chabrol's old belief, more than ever, that it is not the material, but the handling of the material that makes the film. If you were given the script for John Huston's The Maltese Falcon, a gifted cast and a set of slick cameras, it might never occur to you how Huston was able to compose a classic, whereas your film might seem flat by comparison. It was every choice Huston made, angling, lighting, edits, communication of space, that contributed to The Maltese Falcon being one of the most arresting and directorially vivid films of all time, especially of its time. If one had never seen the original 41 Maltese Falcon, attempted to direct a feature based off of its script, and felt disenchanted with the results, viewing it back to back with the original would tell you everything you needed to know about film direction. It might be worth explaining now a brief, relatively, history of the film medium itself, especially in its feature-length variant, so that the priorities and capacities of filmmakers across time can be explored and assessed, as this will assist us engaging and appreciating the qualities of determined filmmakers in the present. If one is wondering why ought one be more impressed with the likes of Werner Herzog or Wim Wenders or Paolo Sorrentino's contemporary films, and not with Michael Bay's Transformers, Avengers 34, or some forgettable Oscar bait drivel, it is because the series of choices being made on the former bracket of films is far more considerate, creative, and sheerly impressive than the latter films relying on enormous budgets, sloppy lavering of clunkily flowing computer graphics, or emotionally manipulative predictability in order to manipulate the viewer into assuming that what they watched was worthwhile and not the equivalent of a McDonald's meal or some cheaper Chinese takeout. It is worth mentioning, I'm not at all against computer graphics in and of itself. I was in fact very fond of James Cameron's Avatar 2 The Way of Water, despite not adoring the original film. I wholly appreciated the two Dune films, partly as a long-time admirer of the novel itself, and I'm one of many who highly appreciate the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy. There is such a thing as a flowing, articulate application of even excessive computer graphics, and a lazy, poorly storyboarded, uncreative use of animation generally. The difference between the Russo brothers directed in Avengers Infinity Gems duology and the Zack Snyder 2021 cut of the Justice League film is demonstrative of the laziness in the former versus the determined, enthused finesse of the latter. Actually, even the two Whedon-directed Avengers films can be positively compared to the later Infinity Gauntlet dribble. The silent era is an excellent means of greater understanding that film is fundamentally a visual medium. The silents had no choice but to communicate their narratives visually, and so their enrapturing nature, purely in this respect, can inform viewers permanently henceforth of the values of this medium. Many can note how, in the early sound era, though partly in response to the Great Depression, it can be said, the Hollywood films are far less risky, aesthetically, flatly adapting stage plays and relying on more script-based shenanigans than actually exploring the technology or aesthetic dimension of the medium itself. The 40s saw film stagnate more than it could have otherwise. The devastation caused by the Second World War was unavoidable, and most filmmaking nations were set back for some time as a result of it. As it happens, America, not being involved in the war until very late 1941, delivered some of the most influential and directorially forward-thinking films of all time at that time, most notably Citizen Kane, but also the aforementioned Maltese Falcon, as well as seminal 39 works such as John Ford's Stagecoach, the 1941 feature from Hitchcock, Suspicion, most or any films by the great director Fritz Lang, or the early Disney animations, Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. I mention animation, which at that time in history was not a prolific form where feature-length films were concerned. Animated films were extremely expensive, especially to compose at the caliber of those early Disney features. The sad reality is that those early Disney features, possibly greater animated than any other Disney, or just animated generally, feature films which came out after it, employed disgusting exploitative practices against their animators, their workers, which enabled the level of quality they achieved, although the application of justice ensured that these undesirable practices were never again inflicted upon suffering animators. Animation is considered a secondary practice in the annals of filmmaking, although fundamentally all filmmaking is animation. I would have called this piece The Significance of Animation, although people would assume that I'm referring to cartoons or applying motion to drawings or computer-composed images, as opposed to just the cinema at large. Really, the rendering of still images, in this case photographs, into pieces portraying the illusion of motion, this is still fundamentally animation, incidentally the cheapest form of animation, still. I'm not suggesting that if it were possible we would discard live-action photography entirely and just animate all of our film media. The live-action texture will always have a tangible lived-in appeal, although it should not be understood as the prime form compared with animation, but another branch of animation, the most realizable and common mode of animation. Even in the digital era, digital cameras are still employing the practice of 24 frames per second. It is still a collation of still images granted the illusion of motion, and attempts to break out of this techno-aesthetic tradition were met with ridicule and general rejection, as in when Peter Jackson released his Hobbit film trilogy as 48 frames per second, which many found unpalatable and unappealing compared to the near or over century-old consensus regarding the 24 frames as being acceptable and seamless for audiences over many multiple decades. People understanding Perhaps understanding all film, live action or otherwise, as animation primarily, fundamentally, will assist one in appreciating why films are seminal acts of composition for their own sake, and why certain mainstream films, or say Oscar bait formulas, are not considered overly impressive to some who are steeped in the concept of film composition, of animation, of the wide extraordinary possibilities of this medium. Whether it be Transformers 3, Fast and Furious 9, some vapid mainstream movie about some soldiers in Iraq, or soap opera insignificance like, say, The King's Speech, there is a wide array of more mainstream films which, in my view, dumb down the medium and are the equivalent of cheap fast food, as opposed to really considered, devised, and compositionally truly impressive acts of filmmaking, animation, or cinematography. What is cinematography, you may ask? Just photography. If I say cinematographic, I mean photographic. A film's photographic qualities in lieu of its motion, its visual texture, its understanding and communication of space, and how it relates with the editing schema of the film. If one notices something in the back of their mind about many films prior to, say, the mid-60s, it is that they tend to frame their action gallantly in front of the camera, everything occurring as though it were in a stage play, you the audience observing straight on. It was more the domain of, say, educational documentary work, with less bulky, heavy cameras, to immerse the viewer with the subject itself, to place their camera, the frame, on the ground with the subjects themselves. It is easy to know the difference between cop films of the 50s or early 60s and the vibrant American films of the 70s, such as The French Connection, Dirty Harry, Serpico, or Shaft. The missing link, however, was not American cinema, but French cinema. The New Wave, or Nouvelle Vague as it is known, was one of the most significant moments in the history of film/animation. No longer was the camera a static thing which displayed events playing out in front of it. Now the camera could be immersed amongst its players, the frame subject to frenetic editing schemas, and the audience could be aware of the camera in motion, or being employed to enhance the story without it breaking immersion whatsoever. The old standard of the Hollywood producers was to insist that the audience never be aware of the camera during the feature film experience. Filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock, but also John Ford and Orson Welles and a few select others, were happy to demonstrate their technical creativity, however, and especially in the case of Hitchcock, the viewing public was also extremely happy that he did so. He was an incredibly successful filmmaker, and so Hollywood was not averse to his explorations in this area. Now, whilst American film critics would scold Hitchcock for his sensational subject matter, his mass entertainment, his lack of interest in, say, adapting high literature or wallowing in grimy social realism, the French film critics, led by Chabrol and others in the influential magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, which exists to this very day, saw Hitchcock as the greatest genius possibly alive directing films at that time. Future insurmountably influential new wave filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard lauded Hitchcock's 1956 work The Wrong Man as proving that the cinema was more able than any other artistic medium at displaying what he referred to as the data of consciousness. Some of the Cahiers critics went on to become iconic film directors of the French New Wave, Nouvelle Vague, namely Godard, Chabrol, Truffaut, Rivette, and Roma, and their championing of what was called auteur theory suggested that the director was the author of a film and that the choices of the director were paramount to a greater appreciation of the form itself, that these compositional components were the most significant trait of the wider medium. The New Wave directors were assisted by the existence of more maneuverable cameras, creating films slightly outside of the studio system, and a desire to experiment with form the way that the visual arts, painting and sculpture, literature, and even music had during the course of the early 20th century, what we now call artistic modernism, say. Film was a young medium, and whilst certain modernist films existed, adjacent to movements occurring simultaneously in the visual arts, they tended to be short subjects, or highly marginalized compared to Hollywood films, just studio-funded films around the world, and generally disappeared for a period between the 30s until the early 60s, for the most part. The Nouvelle Vague was one means by which directors attempted to elevate or advance the medium from its somewhat restrictive norms of the last few decades at that time, though there was also the highly experimental and far more related to the visual arts scenes of that time work of the underground filmmakers typically based in New York, sometimes termed structural film. As it would happen, the iconic visual artist Andy Warhol was possibly the most influential initial contributor to this movement, an era which culminated possibly in an iconic, though rather infamous, feature released in 1967, Michael Snow's 45-minute work Wavelength. Wavelength consists of a gradual zoom-in onto a painting hanging on the wall of a New York City studio apartment, and was intended, or is subsequently assessed as, a meditation on the components of the medium itself, the visual dimension, the application of sound. A drone permeates the runtime, along with street sounds and a brief playing of the Beatles song Strawberry Fields Forever. The intrinsic imbuing of sequential succeeding images, or nature of an image as constituting great significance or flowing thematic coherence, and the element of time, which is as essential to the film experience as it is for mediums like music or theatre, compared with the indefinite time one can stare at painting or sculpture, read a book or comic book. In a respect, wavelength was like the sonic concept of the wavelength applied to the film form, almost like an old TV color test, but with the parameters of a film being considered: image, sound, time, motion, space, and sequential supplementing visual progress. Now, this isn't to say that one ought to find the runtime of wavelength compelling, or they are an ingrate Philistine, but to put in perspective why Michael Snow would have composed this film the way he did. Snow, a Canadian, approached this work and all of his works, film or just sculptural, with a sense of modest humour and sincere curiosity. What would happen if we did this? How would it affect our understanding of films ontologically, compositionally, emotionally? Wavelength is something of a litmus test as to what one is willing to admire in a feature film and why they do. In a sense, it was the ideal, somewhat, first film in existence, which is to say, one can imagine the experiment of wavelength being conducted as a very early exercise in film camera and editing technology, although it was released in '67, long after the French Lumiere brothers had filmed a train arriving at a platform and passengers exiting this vehicle in 1896. For 1970s then, given the influence of the new wave in the mainstream, the American directors of the mid-1960s through the 70s are referred to as American New Wave or New Hollywood filmmakers, and of the underground, say, structural films of the 60s upon the more visual arts-oriented, non-narrative works, forms the basis of much of our modern understanding of both mainstream and alternative underground experimental films, or at least as it was by, say, the 1990s, which our own contemporary culture is still, in some respects at least, directly downstream of. The film tropes of the 90s, mainstream or underground, are rooted in the consolidation of forms, even if these forms vary widely within themselves, of the 1970s. It is worth mentioning that the transition from analog film celluloid to digital film was one that mostly just supplemented, replaced what had already existed, and, with the exception of the application of computer graphics, did not significantly change the mainstream narrative film medium all that much, not that it ought to have or that it was inherently going to do so. Digital simply became the cheaper alternative to film stock, and did not in and of itself significantly alter how films were made, even if it could, or even if it, over time in certain areas, arguably has. The advent of computer generation has led to certain processes in editing narrative films to be easier, more achievable, more seamless, or even more creative, but the digital so-called revolution was less a revolution and more akin to a replacement. The inclusion of computer graphics was significantly altering of the mainstream or lower-budgeted genre films, although the function and ideals of these genre films did not shift greatly with the introduction of CGI. It only optimized or expanded the repertoire of what these films were capable of. The original Star Wars trilogy of 77 to 83 versus the dense computer-generated imagery of the prequel trilogy, both helmed by George Lucas, of course, from 99 to 2005, is entirely indicative of this general development. A major shift, but not a major changing of priorities. Consider the later, non-Lucas composed sequel trilogy and related spin-offs, 2015's The Force Awakens to, say, 2019's The Rise of Skywalker. The merits or lack of these films notwithstanding, they attempted to merge the cited grace of the originals of the flowing seamless CGI of the prequel trilogy after a decade of improvements for the technology, and further proved, to the annoyance of some even, that the priorities of genre films had not significantly changed with the advent and inclusion of CGI across time. The contemporary films or filmmakers which I would point to as evidence of the further development of the medium beyond general escapist entertainment, the equivalent of potato chips and beer, include the seminal genius Zhang Lu. His 2015 film Love and is almost a new wavelength, except it is entirely reliant on digital priorities. It tests the responses to certain stimuli and deconstructs everything we consider inherent or obvious about the medium at large. The great Alexander Sokurov delivered potentially the greatest film adaptation of Goethe's Faust in 2011, as well as a long-take devised exercise in 2015 called Francophonia, and a magnificent application of computer graphics for philosophical purposes, yes, see it to believe it, in 2022's Fairy Tale. great Japanese author Takahisa Zeza had composed some of the most encapsulative films of all time regarding what it is capable of, at least without employing computer graphics, in his films Heaven's Story, My Friend A, The Chrysanthemum and the Guillotine, and Yarn. The very well-known Bong Joon-ho applied mainstream Hollywood action methods for the means of a socially aware escapist picture in 2013's Snowpiercer, CGI for a convicted environmental statement in 2017's Okja, and an attention to cinematographic precision, contemporary culture, and extremely visual storytelling for the cross-cultural recognized masterpiece of 2019, Parasite. Speaking of Oscar favourites or exalted nominees, Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest did more with the visual medium than text or audio ever possibly could, whilst relying so heavily on audio, though also the writing of the film. The nature of the German spoken in the film is highly significant upon the relevant narrative proceedings. And his 2013 project, Under the Skin, did more with computer graphics than most Hollywood films had ever seemingly considered. But while we're on extensive reliance on computer graphics, I would champion James Cameron's Avatar: The Way of Water as one of the greatest feats in the history of animation, as well as the great director Francis Ford Coppola, best known for the Godfather films and Apocalypse Now way back in the 70s, one of the old new Hollywood paragons, who helmed the seminal Megalopolis in 2024, whose fictional building material Megalon is a device which enables construction in the world of the film itself, and also grants the filmmaker a creative excuse to actually employ computer graphics in a narrative which is primarily philosophic or just polemical in nature. In terms of weaving together general historical drama, Spanish director Julio Medem released 8 in 2025, told over 8 specific decades, points in time from 1931 to 2021 in Spain, and not only uses computer graphics to assist in the illusion that each time period is told in one single long take, but uses digital means, not entirely available to an analog celluloid film, to change the actual aspect ratio of the image in correspondence to the displayed historical era to resemble perhaps the films of the specific eras in question. In regards to animation as we traditionally understand it, in this case both examples of computer-generated 3D animation, Chinese filmmaker Xiangpeng Tian's 2020 free work Deep Sea is as magical and absorbing as any children's animated film has ever at least looked, and the Latvian-French project Flow of 2024 would have you convinced that they attached a mocap suit to a very well-behaved thespian cat, although their animation, on a €3.5 million budget no less, was so adept that they were seemingly able to achieve this without having to even consider that. The possibilities of film animation are still demonstrated year by year, though it may require a bit of effort of searching on one's part to locate these films, not often available via the accessible resources, streaming services, cinema chains, or television broadcasts. But the main question, perhaps the most vital, I'd also like to briefly address: why films, feature-length filmmaking, would remain a relevant or technologically contemporary medium of art compared with other forms, the traditional visual arts, music, literature or comic books, video games, or social media or video sharing site uploads, or even just compared to the most popular medium on the planet possibly right now, television shows viewed via streaming services. Films and filmmaking, by which I essentially mean animation and animations, will always summarize the relevant modern technologies and visual forms into itself. Any new video form pioneered via social media will emerge into feature film language either inevitably or the possibility of it is so overt that even if cinema never did incorporate it, or in a meaningful way, it would be plain that it certainly could have if it had chosen to. For an example, the techniques in editing ethos of music videos found their way into the language of mainstream feature films during the late 90s into the turn of the millennium, and some bemoaned it, but certainly most audiences grew to accept and even rather appreciate it. Every new trend in the visual arts could be displayed within the runtime of a film, depicted to a wider public without them having to physically see the artwork itself. Every new innovation in music, which, if any form will remain eternal even beyond film, it will likely be recorded music, can be featured in a film's soundtrack, and obviously television is simply the lazier attributes of narrative filmmaking condensed into effectively soap opera triviality, and the techno-aesthetic of most or all of the contemporary TV shows would be dismissed as meagre or just lacking compared to the other, more refined and considered films around it. then there is no accounting for certain tastes, especially when the ethos of films as potato chips and beer is concerned, and I hate to demonize this approach to watching films too much, at least not beyond simply preferring that it not drown out or just attempt to destroy the existence of an exterior to this limiting approach. Or perhaps I just prefer alternative nibbles and some Sprite instead of the potato chips and beer. Oh, and whether the medium of video games is art is not something I necessarily want to participate in a discussion of, although I will say that if we weren't to consider board games or traditional role-playing games to be art, why video games ought to be conversely considered so is not often enough explained or even just addressed. Just as with those who are engulfed in their music theory, sometimes many modern musical trends could bother you, or perhaps the new generation will be more open minded to it, and some will find a middle ground between the two. I feel the same about cinema. As a filmmaker, obviously a very amateur or at least non professional one, there are modern trends in the medium that excite me, and some that don't. I would hate to have been one of those bores who in the 1980s thought that cinema was going downhill, when it is easy to look back on that decade now as featuring many numerous classic mainstream films, and not even necessarily the ones that more casual audiences will cite, though some of them too, and I'm willing to believe, as some snobs will insist, that the mainstream cinema, at least in the English-speaking world, of the 70s was better. I feel that there is still a case to be made for that, sure. And even more, almost incountable major classics of world cinema and relatively or outright independent circles across the globe that make those who now dismiss the cinema of the 1980s as seeming needlessly traditionalist or overly set and rigid in their priorities. I would prefer to have been one of the individuals to have been, I think rightly in retrospect, excited about how the medium was going. I thoroughly appreciate the developments in the medium from the 80s until certainly the wider 2010s, although I'm willing to admit and believe that with the internet it is easier to assess the 80s as a great decade in cinema, especially where the less readily accessible world cinema is concerned, than it would have been if visiting the average cinema or even film festival at that time. There is a tension here that is worth addressing. Is admiring films that exist beyond the slightly mocking paradigm of potato chips and beer indicative that one scorns such a lifestyle or believes that an alternative must be available beyond this visceral escapism, beyond 9 to 5 workday mundanities? I think it does, and sometimes this will take on a more distinctly political angle, but it doesn't have to. For me, it vaguely does, though I respect that some may want to appreciate variety and experimentation in the film form without necessarily wanting a corresponding change in the society or culture around you. I hope I have summarized the medium relatively sufficiently. If you have any more questions, do feel free to let me know.